Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Rohan Khandelwal. I'm your Marrow SS General Surgery faculty. I'll be talking about the INI SS General Surgery questions in this video. This was the first time the INI SS exam was conducted, and the general surgery questions were a mixed bag. Majority of the questions were from Bailey and Sebastian, and they were covered in the Marrow General Surgery videos. Of course, there were a few questions which were from the latest edition of Sebastian, and some, as usual, were from studies and trials, which are very institutional specific. So let's discuss all of them, because sometimes the topics are repeated in the exam. So this would be a good revision for your NEET SS exam as well, which is coming up in a few days' time. The first question was regarding bariatric surgery. Bariatric surgery is a common topic asked in the exam, and they had asked which is not an indication for bariatric surgery. Now, if you look at the indications, a BMI of 35, of more than 35 with comorbidities, this is true, this is an indication. A BMI of 40 even without comorbidities is an indication. A BMI of more than 25 and need for weight loss is not an indication. This is the correct answer. This is not an indication, and it is not indicated in chronic alcoholic, depressive patients and eating disorders. This is also true, because until unless the patient is willing to make a lifestyle change and dietary changes, you don't do bariatric surgery, because even after the procedure they'll end up eating again and they'll start gaining weight. So they need to inculcate lifestyle changes, and then only they become candidates for bariatric surgery. So if you look at the indications, these are the selection criteria. Those able to adhere to post-operative care, that is regular visits, medical management and dietary supplements. BMI more than 40, BMI more than 35 with obesity complications. You know, the obesity complications can be type 2 diabetes mellitus. There can be hyperlipidemia. There can be hyperlipidemia, there can be obstructive sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, and hypertension. So these are some of the obesity related complications. So if they have obesity related complications and a BMI of more than 35, that is also an indication. One important update is, and this is also given in the latest Sebastian, that somebody with a BMI of more than 30 with recent onset BMI of more than 30 with recent onset diabetes mellitus or metabolic syndrome is also a candidate for bariatric surgery. And in fact, a lot of books use the term metabolic surgery, because bariatric surgery not only helps in weight reduction, but it also helps in improving the diabetic status, the hypertension and the hyperlipidemia. So a better term is metabolic surgery. The exclusion criteria: cardiopulmonary bypass disease, alcohol intake, and if the patient is not willing to make lifestyle changes. These are the exclusion criteria, and you don't carry out bariatric surgery in these patients. The next question was a total giveaway. They had asked which is the first surgeon to receive a Nobel Prize, and the answer for that was Cocker. Cocker received the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work in thyroid surgery, where he brought down the complication risks dramatically. So Cocker was the first surgeon to receive a Nobel Prize, and that too for thyroid surgery. Splenic hilar lymph nodes in gastric cancer classify as which stations? Now we know there are multiple lymph node stations in gastric cancers, and you need to know the basic ones. You need to know at least till 12, because this has also been frequently asked in the exam. So the correct answer here is 10. And if you look at the lymph nodes, you have the right paracardiac, you have the left paracardiac lymph nodes, right? So if you look at the stomach, so one is right paracardiac, 2 is left paracardiac, 3 is along the lesser curvature, 4 is along the greater curvature, 5 is suprapyloric, 6 is infrapyloric, right? So how do we remember this? The odd numbers, you can see odd numbers for the first 6 lymph nodes, odd are on the right, even are on the left. Odd are on the right, even are on the left. So that gives you a rough idea when you are marking the answer. 7 is along the vessels. Now after 6 you have lymph nodes along the vessels. 7 is along the left gastric artery, 8 is common hepatic artery, 9 is celiac artery, 10 is the splenic hilum. 10 is splenic hilum, this is what was asked. 11 is proximal splenic artery. 12 again important, is divided into 12A, B and P. A is along the hepatic artery, B is bile duct and P is portal vein. So the hilar structure, A is along artery, B is along bile duct and P is along portal vein. So these are the lymph node stations which you should remember for the exam. Another question related to stomach was that a patient complains of dyspepsia. He undergoes an upper GI endoscopy and on biopsy maltoma is there, low grade. Right, so what is malt? Malt is mucosal associated. This is mucosal associated lymphoid tissue tumor. Mucosal associated lymphoid tissue tumor. And the most common site for this is the stomach. Most common site for this is the stomach, and this is associated with H. pylori. So that you should know it is associated with H. pylori infection. Now this is a low grade maltoma, and the unique thing about this tumor, a low grade maltoma, is that low grade maltomas respond very well to H. pylori eradication therapy, right? And you know, in H. pylori eradication therapy you have antibiotics. Almost 65 to 70% low grade maltomas will show resolution just with H. pylori eradication therapy. But at the same time, so of course the answer here is antibiotics or H. pylori eradication. But if it is a high grade maltoma, then you have to treat it like a lymphoma, and you have to do proper chemotherapy. You have to do proper chemotherapy if it's a high grade maltoma. Another question from GI surgery was regarding small bowel obstruction, and they had asked that gallstones with small bowel obstruction, what is the diagnostic feature? Again, this was a very routine basic question. Now we know whenever there is bowel obstruction, the initial investigation which we will do is an X-ray abdomen. Right, is an X-ray abdomen, and on X-ray abdomen in gallstone ileus, that means when a gallstone is responsible for bowel obstruction, you will land up with Rigler's triad. There will be Rigler's triad, and Rigler's triad, one of the features of Rigler's triad is pneumobilia. Now why exactly is there pneumobilia? The reason why there's pneumobilia, so this is Rigler's triad, and Rigler's triad has 3 things. There will be features of small intestinal obstruction. So you can see the dilated loops which are there. There is pneumobilia. There is pneumobilia because this is secondary to a cholecystoduodenal fistula. This is secondary to a cholecystoduodenal fistula. So you will have gas from the duodenum going into the biliary tree. And the third point is that there is a radio-opaque shadow. There is a radio-opaque shadow in right lower half. There is a radio-opaque shadow in the right lower half. This is Rigler's triad, which is seen in patients with gallstone ileus. Now, gallstone ileus is a misnomer. It is actually dynamic bowel obstruction, and as I've mentioned, it is secondary to a cholecystoduodenal fistula. The most common site again is not the ileocecal junction, it is the terminal ileum. Rigler's triad I've already told you, and when these patients come with bowel obstruction, the emergency management is of course a laparotomy, and at that time we are just going to deal with the bowel obstruction and not with the fistula and the gallstones. The fistula and the gallstones we will deal with later. we deal in a second sitting is when we do the cholecystectomy. Again, a very straightforward question was, what is the most sensitive investigation for a gastrinoma? And the most sensitive investigation is SRS, that is serotonin receptor scintigraphy or somatostatin receptor scintigraphy, and this is gradually being replaced by a Dota-Tate scan. But SRS, if it is given, you will mark that. If you are given Dota-Tate, you will mark Dota-Tate scan. Now for gastrinomas, another thing which you should know about is the gastrinoma triangle. The gastrinoma triangle or the Passerose triangle has also been asked in the exam many times. This is the gastrinoma triangle or the Passerose triangle, and 90% gastrinomas lie in this triangle. 90% lie in this triangle. This triangle is formed by the junction of the cystic duct with the common bile duct, cystic duct with common bile duct, head and neck of pancreas with the body of pancreas, and second part of duodenum with D3, second and third part of duodenum. So these are the boundaries of the gastrinoma triangle. But what lies in the gastrinoma triangle? So there are two separate questions. What lies is the D1 and the head of pancreas, right? And these are the places from where gastrinomas can arise. Most commonly, it is the wall of the first part of duodenum. It is the wall of the first part of duodenum. And you know that gastrinomas, if the serum gastrin value is more than 1000 picograms per milliliter, that is diagnostic of a gastrinoma. Now, if serum gastrin is less, and you're still suspecting a gastrinoma, we can do a pentagastrin or a secretin stimulation test. And when we do this pentagastrin or secretin stimulation test, the value should rise by more than 200. Value should increase by more than 200 picograms per milliliter, and if it does, that suggests that there is a gastrinoma which is there. So there were two questions regarding pancreatic endocrine tumors. The other question was that a patient comes with a pancreatic mass with a necrolytic migratory rash and diabetes. What is the most likely diagnosis? So this necrolytic migratory rash, you know, is classical of a glucagonoma. So this is classical of a glucagonoma, and this is the necrolytic migratory rash which you get in a glucagonoma. Now glucagonoma, you will get patients with diabetes. There's going to be diabetes in these patients. There will be dermatitis, and this dermatitis or this necrolytic migratory rash is because of deficiency of amino acids, and that is why it has been seen that when these patients are given amino acids, the necrolytic migratory rash will disappear. There can also be depression in these patients. So these are the key features of glucagonomas which you should know, which you know is a tumor of the alpha cells of islets of Langerhans. Insulinoma, you know, is the most common pancreatic endocrine. Insulinoma is the most common pancreatic endocrine neoplasm. VIPoma, patients will come with WDHA syndrome. They come with WDHA syndrome. This has also been asked. This is also known as Werner-Morrison syndrome. And WDHA syndrome is watery diarrhea. WDHA is watery diarrhea, hypokalemia, and achlorhydria. There can also be acidosis in these patients. This is WDHA syndrome, which can be seen in patients with a VIPoma. The next question regarding GIT was again a rectal cancer patient. 8 centimeters from the anal verge with perirectal pad of fat involvement and lymph node involvement. There is no distant metastasis and patient is desirous of a sphincter saving option. Now we know that this is the rectum, this is the anal canal, and the sphincters are lying here. You have the internal and the external anal sphincters. These internal and external anal sphincters will lie in this 5 centimeter area from the anal verge, right? This is where the sphincters are. Now this patient's tumor is 8 centimeters from the anal verge, so it is somewhere here. And because it is involving the perirectal pad, this is a T3N1 disease which the patient has. It is a T3N1M0 because there is no distant metastasis. Now T3N1M0, and the patient is desirous of a sphincter saving surgery. So ideally for such a patient, when it's locally advanced, when it is involving the perirectal pad of fat, it is best to give these patients neoadjuvant chemotherapy. It is best to give these patients neoadjuvant chemotherapy and then do a low anterior resection, right? LAR is, low anterior resection, which can be done. And low anterior resections can be done for tumors which are more than 5 to 5.5 centimeters above the anal verge. So which are more than 5 to 5.5 centimeters above the anal verge, you can do a low anterior resection. Those which are between 4.5 to 5 centimeters, you can do an ultra low AR, ultra low anterior resection in these patients. But those which are less than 4.5 to 5 centimeters, those patients will land up with an abdominoperineal resection. So here the correct answer would be neoadjuvant chemotherapy with low anterior resection. Rectal cancers also respond well to radiotherapy. So sometimes they give neoadjuvant chemo radiotherapy. So there's concurrent CT-RT which is given to downstage the disease, and then the surgery can be carried out. There was another question regarding staging, and this was breast cancer staging, which is a frequent topic asked in the exam. So this question was that a lady comes with a 3 centimeter breast lump with ipsilateral axillary lymph nodes and internal mammary lymph nodes. There are no distant mets. So if you look at the T stage, it is more than 2 centimeters. So this is going to be T2. Now the nodal staging, there are ipsilateral axillary and internal mammary, right? On the same side, there are axillary and internal mammary lymph nodes. So this makes it N3B and M0. So T2, N3B, M0 is the correct answer here. Of course, there might be some discrepancy in the recall. Some students were saying that internal mammary was given but axillary were absent. Some are saying that axillary and internal mammary both were present. So if we consider that internal mammary and axillary both were present, then it is going to be N3B. This is the staging. The update in the 8th AJCC classification. LCIS is no longer considered in situ. LCIS is no longer considered in situ, right? You only have DCIS and Paget's disease. And from T4 disease, T4A is extension to chest wall, but it does not include the pectoral muscles. T4B is either edema, that is PDO, or satellite nodules or ulceration. T4C is A plus B, and T4D is inflammatory carcinoma of the breast. Another thing which has been asked for inflammatory carcinoma also is that more than 1/3 of the breast skin should be involved with peau d'orange. So if more than 1/3 of the breast skin is involved with peau d'orange, then it classifies as T4D. There are certain new definitions for tumor deposits in the lymph nodes, and you should be aware of them. They can be asked in future exams as well. They've definitely been asked in the surgical oncology part. Isolated tumor cells are defined as clusters which are less than equal to 0.2 mm, or it's a cluster of less than 200 cells. Micrometastasis is a deposit of more than 0.2 mm and less than 2 mm. Macrometastasis is any deposit which is more than 2 millimeters. So these are some terminologies which you should know for the exam. There was one question from thyroid swellings, which invariably is there. So there will be questions from breast and thyroid invariably in the general surgery component. So you have a 40-year-old female with a thyroid nodule which is 9 millimeters in size. What is the next step in the management? So here the answer is only reassurance and follow-up, and this is based on the TI-RADS level. Now you know about BI-RADS. BI-RADS is breast imaging reporting and data systems. Breast imaging reporting and data systems, right? And all our decision making regarding breast disorders is based on the BI-RADS score, which is the radiological score, so that there is standardized reporting, right? Similarly, there is a TI-RADS and a LI-RADS score as well. TI-RADS is thyroid imaging reporting and data systems. LI-RADS is liver imaging reporting and data systems, and PI-RADS is prostate imaging reporting and data systems. Now the TI-RADS score takes into account the composition, the echogenicity, shape, margin and the echogenic foci. And based on this, when you add the points for the TI-RADS, you will get various scores. Now if it is TR1, it is benign, no FNAC is required. If it is TR2, it is not suspicious, no FNAC is required. If it is TR3, which is mildly suspicious, FNA only if it is more than 2.5 centimeters, and you just follow if it is more than 1.5 centimeters. TR4 is moderately suspicious. FNAC if it is more than 1.5, follow if it is more than 1 centimeter, and TR5 is highly suspicious, FNA only if it is more than 1 centimeter. So you can see in this question that even if we consider this to be a TR5 lesion, which is highly suspicious, but still according to the guidelines, FNAC is only recommended when it is more than 1 centimeter in size, and this is 9 millimeters. So here we will only follow up the patient. If there is an increase in size in the next follow-up visit, then we can do an FNAC. So this you should know for the exam. There was another question from parathyroid adenomas. They had asked about the ultrasound features of parathyroid adenomas. This was from a direct paragraph from Bailey. They had asked, ultrasound may miss adenomas in the retroesophageal and the retrotracheal location. This is true. Ultrasounds will not be able to differentiate lymph nodes from small adenomas. This is also true, and so many times it happens that even while operating you can miss small adenomas, which is why when we are removing adenomas we take into account the Miami criteria, and the Miami criteria is also very important. Miami criteria is we measure the intraoperative PTH, and 10 to 15 minutes after gland removal, we measure the PTH. If there is more than 50% drop in PTH, if there is a more than 50% drop in PTH, then we know we've removed the right gland or we've removed the adenoma. If the PTH level does not drop by more than 50% in 10 to 15 minutes, then probably we have not removed the right gland. They are hyperechoic in nature. This is false. They are hypoechoic in nature. And giant adenomas are those which are more than 3 centimeters. This is also true. So they are hypoechoic. I've told you. Here you can see that they are hypoechoic. Giant adenomas are more than 3 centimeters. And I've already told you ultrasound may miss adenomas located in the retroesophageal, retrosternal and retrotracheal locations. And it is difficult to differentiate small adenomas from normal appearing lymph nodes. You know the most sensitive is a Sestami B scan. Sestami B scan. 4D CT can also be done. 4D CT can also be done to pick up parathyroid adenomas. The next question was a 5-year-old child with rectal mucosal prolapse. So this is a partial rectal prolapse, partial thickness rectal prolapse, which is reducible by the parents but persistent for 3 months. What is the treatment of choice for this patient? Now we know that if these patients, children can have partial or mucosal rectal prolapse, and when the first episode is there, we should do digital reposition. But if it is recurrent, if it is occurring again and again, then the treatment is sclerotherapy, or we can do Thiers-Schweiring. Then we can do sclerotherapy or Thiers-Schweiring. So the correct answer here is injection sclerotherapy. Now, if we look at rectal prolapse, it can be partial prolapse, which is seen in children. First episode is digital reposition. Recurrent, we do Thiers-Schweiring or sclerotherapy. If it is complete rectal prolapse, that means all layers are involved, then you have to operate these patients, and there are two approaches. You have the perineal approach and you have the abdominal approach. The perineal approaches are easier to perform but have a high recurrence rate, whereas the abdominal approach is more technically challenging, but the complication rates are also more higher, but least recurrence rate is there. Least recurrence rate is there with abdominal procedures. The abdominal procedures are Wells and Ripstein's rectopexy, where a mesh is placed, and the most common complication when we are doing a rectopexy is constipation, right? Because if the mesh is too tightly placed around the rectum, that can give rise to constipation. Thiers-Schweiring, Delorme's repair and Altemeyer's repair are all perineal procedures which you should know about. The next question was a very straightforward question. The most common surgical emergency in pregnancy, patient came with abdominal pain and vomiting in the second trimester, and there was no nausea or vomiting in the first trimester. So you know that the most common non-obstetric abdominal emergency during pregnancy is appendicitis. The classical abdominal symptoms of right iliac fossa pain and McBurney's point tenderness might be missing. And why are they missing? Because as the uterus increases in size, the appendix can be pushed upwards and the pain might be felt a bit higher up. So this is the most common obstetric abdominal emergency during pregnancy. The typical clinical features might not be present. Initial investigation is always ultrasound in these patients, but the best investigation is MRI. So of course CT has radiation exposure risk, so the best investigation during pregnancy would be MRI, and the management of these patients would be appendicectomy, because you know that there is higher chances of perforation. There are higher perforation chances, and if a perforation occurs, that can be associated with a very high rate of fetal loss in pregnancy. So the next question was pertaining to postoperative fever. In fact, there were two questions pertaining to that, and this has in general been a very important topic when it comes to the general surgery part, causes of postoperative fever. So this was a patient post low anterior resection, and the patient develops fever and breathlessness on postoperative day 3. On X-ray, there are bilateral lung infiltrates which are seen. You can see that there are bilateral lung infiltrates, and a picture like this where there's fever, raised TLC and bilateral lung infiltrates are classically suggestive of acute respiratory distress syndrome. Pulmonary embolism would typically occur when the patient has been bedridden for a long time, starts walking and develops breathlessness. That can be a telltale sign of pulmonary embolism. Atelectasis usually develops early on day 1, day 2. Fluid overload will not present with such bilateral infiltrates. There can be some amount of pulmonary edema which can be there, but it will not be infiltrates like this. So these are the causes of post-operative fever which are there. Atelectasis, I told you, occurs on day 1 and you can manage it with chest physiotherapy. Day 2, day 3 would be UTI or thrombophlebitis. So either urinary tract infection or thrombophlebitis. Day 4, day 5, you can have deep venous thrombosis which can be there, or surgical site infection. The definition of surgical site infection has been asked many times. Surgical site infection is any wound infection which occurs within 30 days of surgery, when no prosthesis or implant or mesh has been used, or if a mesh has been used or an implant has been used, then it is till 1 year after surgery. So another question was, a 50-year-old female underwent bariatric surgery and walks for the first time after 3 days. She develops breathlessness soon after taking a trip to the bathroom. What is the most likely diagnosis? So this, I told you, is typical of pulmonary embolism, where the patient was bedridden for a long time and has started walking after that, and this is a telltale sign of pulmonary embolism. And to prevent this, we use pneumatic anti-DVT stockings. These are mechanical prophylaxis. You have mechanical prophylaxis and we have pharmacological prophylaxis, and there is pharmacological prophylaxis as well. You know, pharmacological prophylaxis is better, and pharmacological prophylaxis is in the form of low molecular weight heparin. And that is why before any patient is operated, you have to stratify patients according to the risk of developing DVT, and you give them prophylaxis accordingly. One more criteria which was recently asked in the exam is the Wells criteria. So in any patient where we are suspecting DVT, we follow the Wells criteria. This gives us the risk of DVT in a patient, and if the Wells score is more than 2, then it is highly suggestive that the patient has deep venous thrombosis. Peritoneal breach percentage in TEP. Now you know TEP is total extraperitoneal repair. That means we usually don't breach the peritoneum. If the peritoneum is breached and then you re-enter the preperitoneal space, that is known as TAP. TAP is transabdominal preperitoneal repair. So if there is a peritoneal breach which is happening in TEP, they are asking what is the percentage when we are doing TEP. Now we know TEP is a technically more demanding procedure than TAP, and initially in the early learning curve there can be peritoneal breach, and it is to the tune of more than 20%. That is what has been written in literature and large studies. So more than 20% is the rate. We know in TEP we remain totally extraperitoneal, whereas in TAP we breach the peritoneum and then we come into the preperitoneal space. The next question is that you have a post-trauma patient with complaints of abdominal pain. Systolic BP on admission was 80, but it improved to 120 on administering fluids. Heart rate is 120 and chest X-ray shows a widened mediastinum with loss of aortic knob with no hemothorax or rib fracture. Right. So first of all, the patient did come with hypotension, but it responded well to fluids. Right. So when the patient responds to a fluid challenge, we will consider it as stable vitals. Right. The BP has increased, there is tachycardia, and there is widening of the mediastinum with loss of aortic knob. These are classical features which suggest that there has been an aortic dissection. Right. Now aortic dissection, the investigation of choice for aortic dissection, if the patient is stable like in this case, will be CT angiography, whereas if the patient was unstable, supposing the BP did not improve after giving a fluid challenge, then it would have been a transesophageal echo. echo, right? So here, because it is stable, it is CT angiography. That is the correct answer here. Like I told you, the signs which you see on an X-ray will be loss of contour of the aortic knuckle. There will be a widened mediastinum. There can be a globular heart. Yes, there can be hemothorax in some patients as well. Wasn't there in this case. Aortic dissection, there are two classifications for aortic dissection. You have the DeBakey and you have the Stanford's classification. DeBakey type 1 is the most common. This has also been asked. DeBakey type 1 is the most common, and DeBakey type 1 involves the ascending plus the descending thoracic aorta. Ascending plus the descending thoracic aorta. DeBakey type 2 involves only ascending thoracic aorta, and DeBakey type 3 involves only descending thoracic aorta. DeBakey type 1 and 2 are jointly known as Stanford's A, and DeBakey type 3 is jointly known as Stanford's B. Now, you know that when these patients come with aortic dissection, there is a role of permissive hypotension. This has also been asked in the exam. There is a role of permissive hypotension, right? Because it is said that it is hypertension which triggers the tear in the aortic wall. So, hypertension is going to trigger the tear and then the BP is going to drop. Now, if I suddenly raise the BP, this tear will increase. So, permissive hypotension is when we want the BP to be at the lower limit of normal. When we want BP to be at the lower limit of normal, and to achieve this, we give esmolol in patients with aortic dissection to keep the BP at a lower level. Esmolol is a short-acting beta blocker. This has also been asked. You should know about this. A 55-year-old breast cancer patient who is ER/PR positive is to start anastrozole. Anastrozole, you know, is hormonal therapy. Anastrozole is a type of aromatase inhibitor. They are asking which investigation should be done prior to starting this treatment. Now, this is a routine scenario in my OPD when I treat breast cancer patients. When we have to start them on hormonal therapy, if they are post-menopausal, then we will start these patients on aromatase inhibitors like anastrozole or letrozole. And aromatase inhibitors, the side effect is that they reduce the bone mineral density. They reduce the bone density. That is the main side effect here, that they reduce the bone density. That is why before we start the patient on aromatase inhibitors, we will also always do a DEXA scan for 3 sites to see if there is reduced bone density to start off with or not, right? And if there is reduced density, then we supplement calcium, vitamin D3 supplements. And in severe cases, we might even give bisphosphonates. Which is why it is important to do a DEXA scan before starting aromatase inhibitors. If it's a premenopausal patient, these patients are started on tamoxifen, which is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, and the most common side effect of tamoxifen is hot flushes, right? It is not endometrial hyperplasia. Yes, it can cause endometrial hyperplasia, but the most common side effect is hot flushes. A 38-year-old lady came with bilateral mastalgia. Which of the following drugs is considered to have a placebo effect from various systematic reviews? So, a lot of work has been done in AIIMS Delhi. Dr. Anurag Srivastav has published a lot of papers on mastalgia, and in those papers he had clearly highlighted that evening primrose oil was having a placebo effect in most of the cases, right? Tamoxifen is used in resistant cases of fibrocystic disease. We use short course of tamoxifen. Danazol was also used, is being used as well, but has more side effects than tamoxifen, which is why tamoxifen is preferred. And local diclofenac gel also has a role in patients with mastalgia. But evening primrose oil just has placebo effect. This is a very common scenario which is asked in the exam. Of course, previously they had asked about bowel injury due to a trocar or Verey's needle. Here the situation is that there is a major vessel which has been punctured by the Verey's needle. So you're putting in the Verey's needle and you puncture a major vessel. What is the next step in the management? Now, we've discussed in trauma as well that whenever there is a penetrating injury, supposing a patient comes with a knife to the abdomen, you never take out that knife in the emergency room. You always take it out in the theatre itself. And why are we not pulling out that knife blindly? Because it can have a tamponading effect on the vessel. And when you remove it, bleeding will start. So similarly, if there is a Verey's needle in a major vessel, you don't remove it immediately unless you open the abdomen. So you open the abdomen, see where the Verey's needle is going, and then remove it under vision. We remove it under vision. Okay. So the correct answer here is open the abdomen while leaving the Verey's needle in place. While leaving the Verey's needle in place, that is the correct answer here. Now, trocars, while we are putting in trocars, the epigastric vessels can be injured. There can be epigastric vessel injury. So, if there is bleeding from the trocar site, if there is a bleeding from the trocar site, we can either put in a Foley's. We can put in a Foley's through, this is all given in Bailey, these are all lines from Bailey. So, we put in a Foley's through the trocar site. You will inflate the balloon and you hitch it up. So, you put a Foley's, inflate the balloon and you hitch it up, and that will have a tamponading effect. Or the other way is to take deep bites, right? You will take a deep bites on either side, and that can ligate the bleeding vessel. Of course, it can be done under vision. You can go from the camera and you can see if there is a vessel which is bleeding. You can also take care of it through that. But these are the two ways which are given in Bailey. Hunterian ligature is used for popliteal artery aneurysm. Of course, it is obsolete now. It is no longer done. But this is again given in Bailey. Popliteal artery is the most common peripheral vessel to be involved with an aneurysm. This question has also been asked in the exam. It is the most common peripheral vessel to be involved with an aneurysm, that is popliteal artery. Asymptomatic cases more than 2 centimeter need to be repaired, right? We know for abdominal aortic aneurysms, more than 5.5 centimeters asymptomatic patients are to be repaired. More than 5.5 centimeters asymptomatic patients are to be repaired, whereas for patients with popliteal artery aneurysm, more than 2 centimeter also, if it is asymptomatic, would require repair. The recent treatment is an exclusion bypass, that is, you ligate the aneurysm and bypass using the saphenous vein graft. So, supposing this is the aneurysm which is there, we are going to ligate here, and prior to that we will do a bypass using the saphenous vein, bypass from the proximal to the distal segment. Some people like to do an aneurysectomy as well. You cut the aneurysm, otherwise you can just ligate it and you can do a bypass using the saphenous vein. Phrenic nerve root value, they had asked post cholecystectomy, right shoulder tip pain is the most common complication. Right shoulder tip pain because of retained gas, that can give rise to referred pain to the right shoulder tip, and that is because of the phrenic nerve, which is C345. This was a direct question, nothing much to know here. The sequence of anastomosis in an orthoptic liver transplant. Now, if you see the chapter on Bailey, Bailey has given a very elaborate chapter on organ transplant, and invariably there are a few questions from organ transplant which are asked in the exam. Even the latest Sebastian, the chapters on organ transplants are quite detailed. So, for an orthoptic liver transplant, the correct answer is that suprahepatic IVC, then infrahepatic IVC, and then the porta anastomosis is done. One more thing which you should know, that if you are taking the entire liver, it can be split into two. A split liver transplant can be done, and this has also been asked in the exam. For a split liver transplant, segments 2 and 3, the smaller one can go to a child, whereas 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 can go to an adult. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 can go to an adult. So, this is known as split liver transplant, where with a single liver you can benefit 2 recipients. Now, the anastomotic sequence, this is also given in a diagrammatic manner in Bailey. As I have told you, the anastomotic sequence is suprahepatic IVC, then infrahepatic IVC. So, suprahepatic IVC, infrahepatic IVC. You do the portal vein anastomosis, that is number 3, portal vein anastomosis. 4 is hepatic artery, and 5 is CBD. 5 is CBD. With the CBD, these are the 5 anastomoses which are done. In this order, you should know for the exam this has been asked. Again, a question pertaining to liver resection. So, for liver resection, we want a low JVP, we want a low CVP while we are doing a liver resection, and they are asking that CVP can be rapidly reduced using the following methods. So, we know that if we do a head up position, yes, if we do a head up position, the CVP is going to reduce. So, this is true. Restriction of IV fluids, of course, is also one of the methods. IVC clamping has been highlighted in a few trials as one of the methods for reduction of CVP as well. Dopamine injection is not one of the methods to reduce the central venous pressure. The other 3 are methods to reduce central venous pressure, and this can be used while we are performing a liver resection. A live donor kidney transplant for evaluation of renal vasculature and presence of stone. What would be the preferred investigation? So, there is a patient who has to donate his kidney, and this patient has a renal stone as well, right, has a stone as well. So, to assess the vasculature and to assess the stone, the best investigation will be a helical CT without and with contrast. Why without? We know that non-contrast CT scan is the investigation of choice for renal stones. It is the investigation of choice for renal stones. So, to evaluate the renal stone, a non-contrast scan followed by contrast, which would help in evaluating the vasculature. A patient with a renal stone, it is a partial contraindication, not that they cannot donate, they can be donors as well. It is a partial contraindication. If there are cystine stones, then we need to be more careful, otherwise it is a partial contraindication, and to assess we can do a non-contrast CT, and then with contrast we can assess the vasculature. A male patient presents with numbness and tingling in the hands since a few months. X-ray is shown below. What is the diagnosis? So, this was a case of thoracic outlet obstruction, thoracic outlet syndrome, and you could see a cervical rib here. There was a cervical rib which could be seen on the X-ray. So, the correct answer was a cervical rib giving rise to thoracic outlet obstruction or thoracic outlet syndrome. And this thoracic outlet syndrome, there can be vascular claudication or there can be neurogenic claudication. There can be vascular claudication or neurogenic claudication. The neurogenic claudication, the numbness and tingling, is mainly along the ulnar nerve distribution. Along the ulnar nerve distribution. That is the area where neurogenic claudication will occur and there will be numbness and tingling. The vascular claudication, there are certain provocative tests which will tell us if vascular claudication is there or not. Some of these tests have been asked in the exam. You have the Adson's test. Adson's test is when the affected arm is abducted at 30 degrees from the shoulder while maximally extended, while extending the neck and turning towards the ipsilateral shoulder, right? So 30 degrees and you turn on the same side, right? So this is the Adson's test. You can see here 30 degree, you elevate, you turn on the same side, and you will see that the pulsation is reducing, right? There will be decrease in pulsation. When the patient takes a deep breath, there will be decrease in pulsation. The elevated arm stress test, EAST test, or the Roos test, is when the patient is placed in the surrender position with shoulders abducted to 90 degrees and the patient slowly opens and closes his hands, right? So Roos is both the hands and you open and close, and this will precipitate the symptoms of claudication, both vascular and neurogenic. Both vascular and neurogenic. You have the upper limb tension or the elevate test as well. Mainly Roos and Adson's have been asked in the exam. This is the Wright's test as well, where only a single arm and you feel for the pulsation. Of course, treatment for a cervical rib would be excision of the rib. Also, there can be venous thrombosis. Venous thrombosis or axillary venous thrombosis can give rise to Paget-Schroeder's disease, right? So, in these patients, vascular, you can have venous thrombus as well, and this would be axillary vein thrombosis, and this is known as Paget-Schroeder's disease. Now, this Paget-Schroeder's disease can also develop in patients who are repeatedly using the arm, like weightlifters or javelin throwers. This can even occur in them. Axillary vein thrombosis is known as Paget-Schroeder's disease. So, the next question was a very tricky question. It is not given in surgery books. They had asked the definition of XDR TB. XDR is extremely drug resistant TB. Extremely drug resistant TB is TB which is resistant to INH, rifampicin and all fluoroquinolones and one or more injectable drugs. That is the definition of extremely drug resistant TB. So, drug resistant is when you have resistance to a single drug, when there is resistance to a single drug. MDR TB, multi-drug resistance TB, is when there is resistance to INH, isoniazid and rifampicin, and extremely drug resistant TB is multi-drug resistant plus resistant to best second line drugs as well. That would make it extremely drug resistant TB as well. Which of the following components are not included in the ERAS protocol? ERAS is enhanced recovery after surgery. ERAS is enhanced recovery after surgery. So, ERAS protocol is assuming a lot of importance because everyone is trying to reduce the hospital stay. Everyone wants the patient to move out quickly. Daycare surgeries are happening, faster discharges are happening. So, all those are based on the ERAS protocol. Now, in the ERAS protocol, use of nasogastric tube is encouraged. This is false. We don't like to put in tubes and drains in the ERAS protocol. They are avoided as much as possible. Epidural analgesics are encouraged, true. So, analgesia or pain control is a major area of concern for the ERAS protocol. So, you want to make sure that the patient is pain free, because only when the patient is pain free will they start to move around early. Avoid fat containing foods for 8 hours. This is true. This is also true. Carbohydrate rich liquids can be given till 2 hours before surgery. This is also true. So, there is a concept of carbohydrate loading, and clear carbohydrate rich liquids can be given till 2 hours before surgery as well nowadays. Okay. So, ERAS protocol, you do proper counseling. We avoid mechanical bowel preparation, so avoid bowel prep, that is also a part of ERAS protocol. Solids can be given up to 6 hours prior to surgery. Fatty foods, 8 hours you have to avoid. Clear liquids and carbohydrate rich liquids can be given till 2 hours before surgery. Minimally invasive approach, analgesic control, patient has to be kept warm, adequate nausea and vomiting medications are to be given, and you need to ambulate the patient quickly and start the patient orally as soon as possible. So these are some of the ERAS protocols which are routinely being followed these days. All of the following statements are true regarding pheochromocytomas except. So pheochromocytomas, we first start alpha blockers. This is always true. We always first start alpha blockers. If beta is started first, then there can be unopposed alpha action, and there can be a hypertensive crisis which can occur, which is why we always start alpha blockade first. Phenoxybenzamine is a reversible sensitive short acting drug. This is false. It is irreversible in action, not reversible. And phenoxybenzamine is started first, and phenoxybenzamine is given till postural hypotension develops. We will keep on increasing the dose till postural hypotension develops. So we will keep on increasing the dose. This is clearly written in Bailey. Keep on giving it till postural hypotension develops. And once postural hypotension develops, if tachycardia is there, if tachycardia is present, then we can give a beta blocker. Then you can add a beta blocker if tachycardia is present. The most common complication is intraoperative hypertension and postoperative hypotension. This is also true because once you clip the adrenal vein, then there will be a sudden decrease in the blood pressure, and that is where you need fluids, and sometimes you need dopamine or NORAD infusions as well. Mortality is less than 1% due to better drugs and better outcomes. This is also true. So this is the only thing, that phenoxybenzamine is irreversible. V's criteria for adrenocortical tumors. Again, this was a tough question. Until unless you've read this, very few people will be able to answer. So the answer is perineural invasion is not included in the V's criteria. This is the V's criteria for adrenocortical tumors, which includes the nuclear grade, the number of mitotic figures, atypical mitosis, clear cell component, diffuse architecture, venous invasion, sinusoidal invasion, and capsular infiltration, right? So if 3 or more of the following criteria are there, then it indicates malignancy. So out of these V's criteria, if you have more than 3 positive, then it indicates an adrenocortical carcinoma or malignancy, right? So these are the V's criteria. You don't again need to remember the details, just which all factors are included. The staging for adrenocortical cancers is known as the McFarlane staging. This is also given in Bailey, McFarlane staging. Stage 1 is when the tumor is less than 5 centimeters. Stage 2 is when it's more than 5 centimeters. Stage 3 are locally invasive tumors, and stage 4 is tumor with distant metastasis. Again, a question regarding transplant. They had asked which immunosuppressants have similar mechanism of action. Immunosuppressants are given after transplants, and the correct answer here is tacrolimus and cyclosporin. Both of them are, tacrolimus and cyclosporin, both are calcineurin inhibitors, which in turn reduce the production of interleukin 2. So both are calcineurin inhibitors, which in turn reduce the production of interleukin 2. Sirolimus inhibits T lymphocyte activation. Inhibits T lymphocyte activation. Mycophenolate mofetil, MMF, mycophenolate mofetil, inhibits inosine 5 monophosphate dehydrogenase. This inhibits inosine 5 monophosphate dehydrogenase. So these are the various mechanisms of action of various immunosuppressants. tacrolimus and cyclosporin have similar mechanism of action. The final question was that which of the following is not used as a preservative in skin banking? Now we know that split thickness skin grafts can be stored in skin banks, and these are usually clubbed with burn centers because that is where you require split thickness skin grafts, right? Now this was a very simple question, you could have just reached it by elimination. So formalin, of course, you will not use because formalin is going to fix the skin and you can't put that skin back on a patient, right? Formalin is what we use when we have to preserve specimens. It cannot be used to preserve skin which can again then be put back on another patient, right? So formalin obviously could have been eliminated easily. The other three are routinely used as preservatives for skin banking. Skin banking at 4 degrees centigrade, at 4 degrees centigrade, you can save skin for 3 to 4 weeks. You can keep skin for 3 to 4 weeks at 4 degree centigrade. With some of the techniques like liquid nitrogen, it can even be stored for up till 1 year, but commonly it is at 4 degrees centigrade for 3 to 4 weeks. So these were the questions from general surgery in the INI SS exam. There were around 30 odd questions which were asked, and as I told you, barring 3 or 4 questions which are really absurd, most of the questions could have been attempted if with a reasonable knowledge of Bailey and Sebastian. As I've told you, all these questions, barring the 4-5 absurd questions, have been covered in the Marrow general surgery videos as well. Now, in the later exams with more thrust being given to general surgery, it is a sincere advice that you go through the general surgery videos in Marrow. And even if you can devote 4 to 5 hours every day, you can finish the general surgery videos in less than 10 days. So it's just about sitting in one go and finishing them, and that would give you a great push for your exam. Those candidates who are appearing for the NEET SS exam, please do watch this video at 2x space and note down the important topics. Do read about them because sometimes topics do get overlap. If you have any further questions, please do post them in the comment section. I'll be happy to answer them. Do subscribe to the Marrow SS, Marrow Super Speciality YouTube channel because we keep on posting a lot of useful content there. If you still have any queries, you can reach out to me on Instagram, and my ID is left-handed surgeon. Thank you.